Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves transported back to ancient Rome, not to the gleaming marble halls of the Forum or the roaring spectacle of the Colosseum, but to something far more relatable, your apartment. Imagine the smell of wood smoke and cheap garlic hanging heavy in the air as you trudge up a seemingly endless flight of rickety stairs. Above you, the sounds of children squabbling and someone practicing the lyre, poorly. Below, the tantalizing, and probably questionably sourced, aroma of street food. Living in ancient Rome wasn't all togas and triumphs, my friend. You're far more likely to be dodging chamber pots emptied from windows than discussing philosophy with Cicero, and you probably won't survive this without a decent pair of sandals and a strong stomach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's face it, the Rome we see in movies is a bit of a fantasy. All those sparkling white villas and spacious public baths. Sure, some people live like that. The ultra-rich, of course. But for the vast majority of Romans, life was a bit more cramped, a lot more smelly, and definitely less Instagrammable. You, my friend, are not a patrician. You're one of the plebs, and you're heading home to your insula. Now, insula translates to island, but in this case, it refers to the multi-story apartment buildings that house the majority of Rome's population. Think of them as the ancient world's version of a tenement block. You're probably wondering, how tall were these things? Well, legally, they were capped at around 70 Roman feet, which is roughly 65 modern feet. But let's be honest, building codes weren't exactly strictly enforced back then. So, you might find yourself scaling 5, 6, even 7 stories. Hope you didn't skip leg day. As you start your ascent, you notice the construction is questionable. Mostly wood, with some brick facing, which, surprise, surprise, made them incredibly susceptible to fire. And fires were a common occurrence in ancient Rome. Just think of the density of people living in those buildings, cooking with open flames, and using oil lamps for light. Disaster waiting to happen, really. You might want to consider a fire escape plan. Hint, there wasn't one. Now, let's talk about rent. It's a concept as old as civilization, and just as annoying. You likely are paying your landlord, a domus owner renting out space in their insula. Your rent would depend on a few factors: location, size, and floor. Naturally, the lower floors were more expensive. Easier access, less climbing, and closer to street-level amenities. The higher you go, the cheaper it gets. Of course, you also get more stairs, more noise, and a higher chance of being trapped in a fire. Pick your poison. As you continue climbing, you can't help but notice the lack of conveniences. Namely, plumbing. That's right, no running water. No toilets. You're relying on public latrines, which, let's just say, were not known for their hygiene. And for everything else? Well, there were chamber pots. And those chamber pots had to be emptied somewhere. This is where the infamous Roman custom of shouting *cave canum* or beware the dog before tossing the contents out the window comes in. Only, it wasn't always dog you had to worry about. Historians still argue whether this practice was truly as widespread and reckless as commonly depicted, but archaeological evidence suggests, well, let's just say you'd be wise to keep an eye out and perhaps invest in a sturdy umbrella. Now, you've finally reached your apartment. It's probably a single room, maybe 2 if you're lucky and can afford it. Space is tight. You share a wall with your neighbor, who seems to have a penchant for loud arguments and even louder music. The furniture is sparse: a bed, a table, maybe a couple of stools. If you're lucky, you might have a small brazier for cooking and heating, although that just increases your chances of starting a fire. The main source of light is whatever filters in through the window. And those windows? Well, they were often just openings in the wall, covered with shutters or cloth. Glass was expensive, so you're not exactly enjoying panoramic views. You're mostly getting a glimpse of the opposite insula and a healthy dose of street noise. Speaking of noise, let's talk about your neighbors. In an insula, you're living cheek by jowl with people from all walks of life. Merchants, artisans, laborers, freed slaves, a real melting pot of Roman society. This could be a great opportunity to make new friends and learn new skills. Or it could be a constant source of irritation, depending on your neighbor's habits and personalities. There will be children running around, shouting and playing games. Tradesmen hammering and sawing. Street vendors hawking their wares. It's a symphony of urban chaos. Adding to the chaos is the fact that many insulae had shops and workshops on the ground floor. Bakeries, taverns, cobblers, you name it. This meant constant foot traffic, deliveries, and the general hustle and bustle of commercial activity. Try sleeping through that. The noise and smells from these businesses would permeate the building, adding another layer to the sensory overload of Roman apartment living. You'd never be bored, but you'd definitely be exhausted. And let's not forget the critters. With so many people living in close proximity, and with questionable sanitation practices, pests were a constant problem. Rats, mice, fleas, cockroaches, they all thrived in the insulae. You're sharing your living space with uninvited guests. Setting traps and keeping your food stored securely were essential skills for survival. And praying to the household gods for pest control couldn't hurt either. Another fringe historical tidbit, Romans sometimes kept cats to deal with these pests. It's believed cats were introduced to Rome from Egypt. So, you might find a furry friend or foe wandering through the insula, depending on whether you're a rat or a Roman. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds awful. Why would anyone live like this? Well, the answer is simple: necessity. Rome was a booming metropolis, and people flocked there in search of opportunity. The insulae provided affordable housing for the masses, even if the quality of that housing was questionable. It was better than sleeping on the streets, and it gave you a base from which to pursue your dreams, however modest they might be. But even in these less than ideal conditions, life went on. People fell in love, raised families, made friends, and pursued their passions. They found moments of joy and connection amidst the squalor and chaos. They celebrated festivals, shared meals, and supported each other through difficult times. They were, in essence, just like us, trying to make the best of the hand they were dealt. And, you know, every once in a while someone would strike it rich and move out to a fancy villa. Then everyone else got to fight over who got their slightly bigger, slightly less rat-infested room. Ah, progress. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk insulae. You know, those towering apartment blocks that made up so much of ancient Rome? Forget the sprawling villas and manicured gardens you see in movies. This is where most Romans actually lived. Think of it as the ancient Roman equivalent of, like, a slightly shadier, much less structurally sound, high-rise apartment complex. And instead of a doorman judging your takeout choices, you've got, well, probably rats. But more on that later. Imagine yourself, right, trudging through the bustling streets of Rome. The air is thick with the smells of street food, garum, that pungent fermented fish sauce, is everywhere, and the sounds of vendors hawking their wares. You're jostling shoulders with senators in their togas, slaves carrying heavy loads, and kids kicking around what probably used to be someone's lunch. You look up. Way up. And that's when you see them, the insulae. They dominate the skyline, these multi-story structures, a testament to Roman engineering, albeit one that occasionally threatened to, you know, not engineer anymore and just collapse. Seriously, these things were often built on the cheap. The higher you go, the sketchier it got. You might even find yourself questioning your life choices that led you to even looking for accommodation here. Don't worry, everyone does. But before we climb those stairs, and trust me, you'll be climbing lots of stairs. Let's talk about what these things were made of. The base, the ground floor, was usually constructed with opus cementitium, basically Roman concrete. It was a mix of rubble, mortar, and volcanic ash, which actually made it surprisingly strong. Well, relatively. Think of it as the sturdy foundation upon which questionable decisions were made. This is where the shops and taberni were located, the street-level businesses that kept the city humming. So as you walk along you might pass a potter's shop, with the warm glow of his furnace, or a bakery, and catch a whiff of fresh bread, which would be a welcome smell amongst the other aromas you'd have to contend with. Above the ground floor, things got a little less robust. The upper levels were often constructed with opus mixtum, a less expensive and quicker to build combination of brick and concrete. Or sometimes, just brick. Or sometimes, just hope. This is where the apartments were stacked, one on top of the other, reaching for the sky, or at least, reaching for as high as Roman building codes, and the landlord's audacity, would allow. And even those weren't always followed. Speaking of height, you might be thinking, how tall could these things possibly get? Good question. Officially, the height limit was set at around 70 Roman feet, that's about 20 meters, or 65 feet, for you modern folks. Emperor Augustus, in an attempt to prevent widespread disaster, put that law into place. However, laws are like suggestions, right? Especially when profit is involved. It wasn't unheard of for builders to slightly exceed that limit. Just a little bit. Maybe add another floor or two. What's the worst that could happen? Well, earthquakes, fires, structural collapses, minor inconveniences. Historians still argue whether these height restrictions were actually adhered to or if they were more of a guideline. And about those fires. Oh boy. Fire was a constant threat in ancient Rome, especially in the Insulae. You've got open flames for cooking and lighting, cramped living conditions, and a whole lot of flammable materials. It was a recipe for disaster. And disasters happened. A lot. Which brings us to one of ancient Rome's biggest, most infamous disasters, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. While the fire is often blamed on Emperor Nero himself, some historians believe that the densely packed and poorly constructed insulae contributed significantly to the fire's rapid spread. Plus, legend has it that Nero played his lyre while Rome burned. Talk about a bad soundtrack to a tragedy. Now, let's talk layout. Imagine yourself squeezing through a narrow doorway into the insula. The first floor is generally the most desirable, so you would find the more wealthy citizens and tenants there. The further up you went, the smaller and cheaper the apartments became. You get what you pay for, right? The ground floor apartments, the sanacula, would have had multiple rooms, sometimes even with running water, if you were really lucky. However, most of the residents had to haul water from public fountains and carry it up all those stairs. And those stairs. Narrow, steep, and often poorly lit. Imagine doing that multiple times a day, carrying water, groceries, or whatever else you needed. It's a good workout, I guess. But it's also a great way to build character. Or a bad back. Or both. The stairs were usually made of wood, which, again, wasn't ideal when fire was a constant threat. You see a pattern forming here, right? As you ascend, the apartments get smaller and more basic. The top floors, the subteguli, were often little more than cramped attics. They were cheap, yes, but they also had the disadvantage of being the most exposed to the elements. In the summer, they were sweltering hot, in the winter, freezing cold. And if it rained? Well, let's just say you might want to invest in a good umbrella. Inside the flats you will find sparse furnishings and maybe a small hearth for cooking and heating, if you could afford the fuel. Privacy was a luxury you couldn't afford. You could hear your neighbors arguing, cooking, and, well, doing everything else. And speaking of neighbors, living in an insula was a communal experience, whether you liked it or not. You shared walls, stairwells, and courtyards. You knew your neighbor's business, and they knew yours. This could lead to a strong sense of community, but it could also lead to, well, let's just say things could get interesting. You also shared other things. Like rodents. And insects. Remember those rats I mentioned earlier? They were everywhere. Cockroaches, fleas, bedbugs, the whole delightful package. Sanitation wasn't exactly a top priority in ancient Rome, especially in the Insulae. There were public latrines, but they weren't always conveniently located. And disposing of waste? Well, let's just say that tossing it out the window wasn't unheard of. Hence the phrase, mind your head while you were walking. Now, you might be thinking, why would anyone choose to live in these conditions? Well, the answer is simple, necessity. Rome was a booming city, and people flocked there in search of opportunity. But housing was scarce and expensive. The Insulae were the only affordable option for many Romans. So you put up with the cramped living conditions, the noise, the smells, and the ever-present threat of fire and collapse. You just did what you needed to do to survive. As they say, location, location, location. Even if that location is one rickety staircase away from plummeting to your doom. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Despite the challenges, life in the Insulae could be vibrant and exciting. You were in the heart of the city, surrounded by shops, markets, and entertainment. You were part of a bustling community, filled with people from all walks of life. You were living in ancient Rome. And there was always something going on. Sometimes, even if that something was the building next door falling to pieces. You gotta admit, it beats paying rent in this economy. Let's think for a minute about the social stratification that the Insulae represented. The ground floor was often occupied by shops and businesses, catering to the needs of the residents and passers-by. These were the commercial hubs of the city, the places where people came to buy food, clothing, and other necessities. The upper floors, however, were where people lived. And the higher you went, the poorer you tended to be. It was a vertical representation of Roman society, with the wealthy at the bottom and the less fortunate at the top. Now you can see how Rome was a class system. One quirky tidbit is that some Insulae even had elevators. Okay, maybe not elevators in the modern sense. But they had rudimentary hoists that could be used to lift goods, and sometimes people, to the upper floors. It was a clever invention, but they were probably about as reliable as the rest of the building. I wouldn't trust one. The Insulae provide a fascinating glimpse into the lives of ordinary Romans. They were a product of their time, a reflection of the city's rapid growth, its social inequalities, and its engineering ingenuity. They were also a testament to the human spirit, the ability to adapt and survive in challenging circumstances. Sure, they were cramped, noisy, and sometimes downright dangerous. But they were also home. And for many Romans, that was enough. Now, if you don't mind, I might take a nap. All this Roman history is making me tired. Sweet dreams. Or, you know, somnia dulcia as they would have said in ancient Rome. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's just drift into the less than thrilling, yet vitally important, world of building materials. You trudge along these narrow alleyways, the air thick with the aroma of, well, everything. Spices, incense, unwashed bodies, questionable street food, and just a hint of something vaguely floral that's valiantly trying to mask the rest. It's a sensory symphony, wouldn't you say? Or maybe more of a sensory mosh pit. You notice, as you pass, the closely packed buildings. Really, closely packed. Elbow to elbow. Shoulder to shoulder. The kind of density that makes modern urban planners break out in hives. And you start to wonder, naturally, about what these things are made of. Because, spoiler alert, it's not reinforced concrete and fire-retardant drywall. Mostly, you're looking at wood. Lots and lots of wood. Timber frames, wooden walls, wooden shingles, wooden everything. Think of it as a giant, meticulously crafted, tinderbox. Now, wood isn't inherently evil, okay? It's a readily available, relatively inexpensive, and surprisingly strong building material. People have been building with wood for, I don't know, millennia. It's renewable, sustainable, until it bursts into flames. Then it's just flammable. You run your hand along a weathered wooden beam. It feels solid, reassuring, almost ancient. The wood likely came from forests outside the city, hauled in by ox cart or floated downriver. Wood was the plastic of its day, basically. But the issue isn't just the wood itself. It's how it's used. You see, back in the day, space was a premium. Land was expensive. So, builders crammed as much building as possible onto as little land as possible. This meant buildings were built very close together, often sharing walls. If one building caught fire, well, let's just say the chances of it spreading were, shall we say, rather high. Imagine dominoes. Wooden dominoes. Covered in oil. Now, you might be thinking, surely, they had some way to fight fires back then, right? Well, yes and no. They certainly weren't sitting idly by as their city turned to ash. Fire brigades existed, of a sort. Often organized by guilds or neighborhoods, these valiant, if somewhat amateurish, firefighters would rush to the scene with buckets of water, axes, and a whole lot of frantic energy. The problem was, they were often woefully under-equipped and under-trained. A bucket brigade is only so effective against a raging inferno. It's like bringing a squirt gun to a dragon fight. And the water? Oh, the water. Where did they get it? Usually from wells or rivers, which weren't exactly conveniently located, especially when you're talking about densely packed, narrow streets. Plus, the water itself might not have been the cleanest. You could very well be extinguishing a fire with, well, let's just say less than pristine fluids. There's also the problem of fire breaks. Or, rather, the distinct lack thereof. A fire break is basically a gap in the built environment designed to stop a fire from spreading. Think of a wide street, a park, or even a deliberately demolished building. These were rare in these crowded cities. Land was too valuable to waste on something as unproductive as a fire break. It's a classic case of short-term gain, long-term fiery pain. Historians still argue whether certain devastating urban fires were exacerbated more by poor firefighting techniques or the simple lack of fire breaks. And then there's the matter of building codes. Or, again, the distinct lack thereof. Modern building codes are designed to ensure structures are safe and up to certain fire-resistant standards. They specify things like the types of materials you can use, how far apart buildings have to be, and the presence of fire suppression systems. Back in the day? Not so much. It was more like, build it however you want, just don't let it fall down. Unless, of course, it dramatically burned down first. Speaking of which, fire was a constant threat. A stray spark from a cooking fire, an overturned lamp, a careless candle, any of these could be enough to ignite a conflagration that could consume entire neighborhoods. Think of the Great Fire of London in 1666, or the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Massive urban areas turned to smoldering wreckage in a matter of days. The Great Fire of London, by the way, allegedly started in a bakery. So next time you enjoy a croissant, take a moment to appreciate the fact that it didn't burn down an entire metropolis. Though, it might have burnt your toast. And it wasn't just the big, headline-grabbing fires that were the problem. It was the constant, low-level risk. The small fires that were quickly extinguished before they could spread too far. The near misses that kept everyone on edge. The sheer anxiety of living in a place where your home could go up in flames at any moment. It must have been stressful. It's important to note that there were attempts to mitigate the fire risk. Some cities mandated the use of tile roofs instead of flammable wooden shingles. Others required residents to keep buckets of water readily available. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, on the lookout for fires. But these measures were often inadequate, poorly enforced, or simply ignored. Human nature, you know. One interesting, and slightly grim, solution some cities employed was the concept of fire insurance marks. These were metal plaques that were affixed to buildings that were insured by a particular fire insurance company. The idea was that if a fire broke out, the fire company would prioritize extinguishing the blaze in buildings that displayed their mark. It was basically a form of early capitalism, where your life depended on whether or not you could afford to pay for protection. Think of it as a very literal pay-to-win scenario. Now, let's talk about the materials themselves a little more. Beyond wood, you also see the use of thatch for roofing. Thatch is basically dried straw or reeds, and while it can be surprisingly durable and weatherproof, it is also, shall we say, rather flammable. It's like living under a giant haystack. And what about heating and lighting? Open fires were the primary source of heat, and candles or oil lamps provided light. Both of these things, of course, involve fire. Inside your house, surrounded by flammable materials. What could possibly go wrong? I'm pretty sure the fire safety rating of an open flame indoors is about as good as that of a paper airplane in a hurricane. You can almost feel the ever-present fear of fire hanging in the air, like a smoky shroud. It's a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. You imagine people going to bed each night, wondering if they'll wake up to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames. It would make for some pretty restless sleep. Sweet dreams, eh? It's also worth noting that the very architecture of these buildings contributed to the fire hazard. Overhanging eaves, narrow passageways, and internal courtyards all created drafts and chimneys that could quickly spread flames. The buildings were basically designed to be efficient fire-spreading machines. A lot of the houses were built with the upper floors overhanging the lower ones, sort of like a reverse pyramid. While that gave you a tiny bit more space, it meant that fires on the ground floor would lick up the building, setting each floor alight as it went. Quirky tidbit time. There were folk beliefs around fire. Some believed that specific saints could protect you from fires, and they'd pray to them for safety. Others used charms, or had rituals they thought would ward off flames. One that pops to mind is a belief that placing bread in the oven before a fire started could stop the flames from spreading. Think of it as culinary fire suppression. The constant threat of fire shaped the lives of people living in these cities in profound ways. It influenced their architecture, their social organization, and even their religious beliefs. It was a reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present power of nature. A natural disaster was a constant presence in the back of your mind, always just a stray ember away. Historians still argue whether the frequency of fires led to a heightened sense of community and cooperation, as people relied on each other for help in times of crisis, or whether it fostered a sense of paranoia and distrust, as people worried about their neighbors' carelessness. So, as you continue your stroll through this densely packed city, remember the ever-present threat of fire that loomed over its inhabitants. It's a reminder of the challenges they faced and the ingenuity they employed in trying to survive in a world that was, quite literally, always on the verge of going up in flames. And now, as the sun sets on this particularly fiery topic, it's time for me to, wait, no, not yet. Still going. Okay, let's dive into the captivating and, dare I say, slightly infuriating world of Roman rentals. It's a tale as old as the hills themselves, or at least as old as, well, Rome. You trudge down a cobblestone street, the midday sun baking the back of your neck. The scent of espresso and exhaust fumes hangs heavy in the air, a uniquely Roman cocktail. You're on the hunt. The hunt for the holy grail of urban living, a decent apartment that doesn't require selling your kidneys on the black market. You've scrolled through countless listings, each one more depressing than the last. Charming attic studio translates to slightly larger closet with a view of a brick wall. Authentic Roman experience apparently means plumbing that dates back to the Roman Empire, literally. The reality of renting in Rome, my friend, is a constant negotiation between hope and despair. You see, landlords here hold a significant amount of power, a power seemingly granted to them by divine right, or at least by a severe shortage of affordable housing. It's a power they wield with the subtle grace of a gladiator wielding a blunt spoon. Think about it. Back in ancient Rome, owning property was a status symbol, a sign of power and influence. The wealthy patricians held vast estates, while the plebeians often struggled to secure even basic shelter. This inherent imbalance, this deeply ingrained societal hierarchy, seems to have stubbornly clung to the Roman DNA, manifesting itself in the modern rental market. It's like the ghost of emperors past whispering into the ears of contemporary landlords, charge them more. They have nowhere else to go. You finally arrive at the address, a crumbling palazzo that looks like it's been through a few too many earthquakes, and possibly a minor barbarian invasion or two. The portiere, a wizened old woman who seems to have been guarding the building since Romulus and Remus were knee-high to a wolf, eyes you with suspicion. After a series of complicated hand gestures and mumbled Italian phrases, you're finally allowed inside. The apartment itself is, well, it's an apartment. The floors are slightly uneven, the walls are painted a shade of beige that screams institutional blandness, and the kitchen is equipped with what appears to be a miniature oven designed for baking doll-sized pizzas. And you can feel the humidity clinging to you like an unwanted admirer. The rent? Exorbitant. Absolutely ludicrous. You could probably buy a small island in the Pacific for the same price. Okay, maybe not, but you get the idea. But hey, it's Rome. You can almost hear the echoes of history swirling around you. Imagine, Julius Caesar might have once walked on these very cobblestones. Of course, he probably wouldn't have been dealing with leaky faucets and landlords demanding 3 months' rent up front, but still, it's something, right? And this is where the financial realities of urban life in Rome kick in. The average Roman, especially younger generations, often finds themselves caught in a precarious cycle of low wages, high rents, and limited opportunities. Many are forced to live with their parents well into their 30s, a phenomenon known as bambaccioni, big babies, a term former economy minister Tommaso Padoa-Schiappa famously coined to describe them. Ouch. It's a tough situation, and let's be honest, a little bit depressing. You're surrounded by beauty, history, and culture, but you're constantly battling the daily grind of trying to make ends meet in a city that seems determined to squeeze every last euro out of your pockets. You sit in a tiny trattoria, nursing a lukewarm espresso. The aroma of fresh pasta wafts through the air, a momentary distraction from your apartment hunting woes. You watch the locals chatting, laughing, gesticulating wildly. There's a vibrant energy here, a palpable sense of community that somehow makes it all worthwhile. You think to yourself, maybe, just maybe, I can make this work. But then you remember the water bill is due and that the landlord still hasn't fixed the window you reported 6 weeks ago. Now, let's delve into a slightly quirky tidbit, shall we? Did you know that in ancient Rome, landlords often used elaborate methods to collect rent, including hiring thugs to intimidate tenants and even resorting to physical violence? I guess some things never change. Of course, these days, landlords are far more civilized. They simply threaten to increase your rent by 50% if you dare complain about the mold growing in the bathroom. Much more subtle, don't you think? Historians still argue whether the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few wealthy families contributed to the decline of the Roman Republic. It's a complex question with no easy answers, but it certainly highlights the enduring power of property and its impact on society. And look around you today, is anything really different? The sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the ancient ruins. You walk past the Colosseum, its majestic presence a stark reminder of Rome's glorious past. You can almost hear the roar of the crowd, the clash of gladiators, the cries of the condemned. It was a brutal and unforgiving world, but also a world of incredible innovation, art, and culture. And that's the paradox of Rome, isn't it? It's a city of contrasts, a city of beauty and decay, of wealth and poverty, of ancient history and modern struggles. It's a city that can inspire you one moment and frustrate you the next. You feel like a modern gladiator, fighting to survive in a complex and challenging arena. You finally give up on apartment hunting for the day and decide to treat yourself to a gelato. Stracciatella, of course. A little bit of sweetness is exactly what you need to lift your spirits. As you savor the creamy coolness, you spot a group of tourists posing for photos in front of the Trevi fountain. You can almost hear the clinking of coins as they toss them into the water, making wishes for love, happiness, and maybe, just maybe, a decent apartment in Rome. You think, wouldn't it be nice if that actually worked? You join the throng of people, the gelato slowly melting in your hand. You toss a coin into the fountain, not really believing in its power, but hoping nonetheless. Maybe, just maybe, your luck will change. Maybe tomorrow, you'll find that perfect apartment, the one that's affordable, spacious, and doesn't smell vaguely of cat urine. And maybe, just maybe, your landlord will actually fix that leaky faucet. But let's be realistic, what are the odds? And speaking of odds, here's another little tidbit for you. During the reign of Emperor Augustus, a law was passed limiting the height of apartment buildings in Rome to 70 Roman feet, about 69 modern feet. This was ostensibly done to prevent buildings from collapsing, but some historians believe it was also intended to curb the power of wealthy landlords who were constructing massive apartment blocks and exploiting tenants. So even back then, the struggle was real. One might even say it was preordained. It's a cycle of struggle, one that you are now a part of. Welcome to Rome. Okay, alright, settle in, settle in. Let's keep going, shall we? Just, imagine I'm gently adjusting your blanket as we talk. Soothing, right? You trudge up the stairs. Each step groans under your weight, a chorus of ancient complaints echoing in the narrow stairwell. It's dark. Like, really dark. Forget that romantic candlelit dinner vibe, this is more, stumbling into a wall and cursing your ancestors dark. You reach out, hands scraping against the rough, uneven plaster. Hope you didn't get a fresh manicure. These Insula stairways, you see, weren't exactly designed with leisurely strolls in mind. Function over form was the motto, and function apparently meant, efficiently pack as many people as possible into as little space as humanly imaginable. Think of them as the ancient Roman equivalent of a fire escape, only, you know, permanently inside and significantly less structurally sound. The higher you climb, the more pronounced the smell becomes. It's a cocktail. A charming blend of stale urine, yesterday's dinner, and the ever-present, underlying aroma of damp stone. Delicious, isn't it? Apparently, chamber pots weren't always emptied with the greatest diligence. Add to that the fact that personal hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority for everyone back then, and you've got yourself a truly authentic Roman sensory experience. You can almost taste it, can't you? Don't. Please don't. One thing you definitely can't taste? Clean air. Ventilation was a luxury in these buildings, especially in the upper floors. Which leads us neatly to our next point, natural light. Or, rather, the distinct lack thereof. Imagine living in a world without electricity. Seems almost quaint now, doesn't it? But for the vast majority of people in ancient Rome, the sun was the primary light source. And when you're crammed into a multi-story apartment building with tiny windows, well, sunlight becomes a highly coveted commodity. The upper floors of the Insulae were notoriously dim. Natural light had to fight its way through narrow alleys and past other buildings to reach you, leaving your apartment shrouded in perpetual twilight. Think perpetually overcast British weather but indoors. And with more aromas. Forget Instagrammable golden hour selfies. Your life is now a study in chiaroscuro, a dramatic play of light and shadow where you're never quite sure what's lurking in the darker corners. Probably just a rat. Probably. Now, If you were wealthy, you might have had access to larger windows or even an interior courtyard to let in more light. But you're not wealthy, are you? You're just another plebeian, clinging to the bottom rungs of the Roman social ladder. So you squint, you strain, and you probably develop a vitamin D deficiency. Historians still argue whether widespread vitamin D deficiency contributed to other ailments among the plebeian class of ancient Rome. It's a fascinating rabbit hole to fall down, if you're into that sort of thing. Let's talk privacy, or the absence thereof. The walls in these insulae were notoriously thin. Paper thin, almost. You could practically hear your neighbors breathing, arguing, and, well, engaging in other activities. Let's just say soundproofing wasn't exactly a priority for Roman builders. Imagine trying to have a private conversation when your neighbors can hear every single word. Awkward, right? Now imagine trying to conduct your entire life under those conditions. Forget pillow talk, it's more like shouting sweet nothings into a shared abyss. It gets worse. The windows, which were already small to begin with, often lacked glass or even shutters. This meant that anyone passing by on the street could potentially peek inside. Suddenly, your cozy little apartment feels more like a stage, and you're the unwilling performer in a never-ending reality show. Apparently, some Romans even tried to use thin sheets of oiled cloth or parchment to cover their windows and provide a bit more privacy. Good luck with that, I guess. You're basically trading light for slightly less visibility. It's like trying to block out the sun with a napkin. And if you thought privacy was bad during the day, wait until nightfall. The dim light of oil lamps would cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making your already cramped apartment feel even more claustrophobic. Every creak, every rustle, every cough from your neighbors would be amplified in the darkness, turning your humble abode into a symphony of subtle anxieties. Living in an insula, you see, was a constant negotiation between necessity and compromise. You traded space and privacy for affordability and proximity to the city's opportunities. It was a bargain, perhaps, but one that came at a considerable cost. One fringe historical theory posits that the lack of privacy in insulae contributed to the Roman obsession with public spectacles and displays. After all, if you can't find privacy at home, why not seek entertainment and catharsis in the arena? It's an interesting thought, though difficult to prove definitively. We've already established that hygiene wasn't always great, right? One of the biggest challenges in these multi-story buildings was waste disposal. Think about it, you're living several stories above the street, without running water or indoor plumbing. Where does everything go? Well, sometimes, it went out the window. Yup. Residents would often simply toss their waste, both liquid and solid, out into the street below. I know, charming, isn't it? Hence the phrase, cave canem, or beware of the dog, which was often inscribed on doorsteps. While it literally meant to watch out for a dog, it also served as a general warning to watch where you step. Or, perhaps more accurately, watch what falls on you from above. Surprise! And what about bathing? Public bathhouses were a popular option, of course, but they weren't exactly known for their hygiene. Think of it as a communal bath, where hundreds of people would share the same water throughout the day. On the plus side, the large bathhouses had different temperatures of water and also saunas available. On the minus side, you were swimming in other people's, well, let's just say it wasn't the most sanitary experience. And for those who couldn't afford or didn't want to brave the public baths? Well, they made do with what they had. Maybe a quick sponge bath in a shared basin. Maybe just a strategic application of perfumed oil to mask the odors. Desperate times, desperate measures. The perfumed oil reminds me of this one time I went camping and, you know what, never mind. That's a story for another time, when you're really in need of some ASMR to go terribly wrong. Let's consider one mainstream historical fact, fire. Ah, yes, fire. A constant threat in the ancient world, especially in densely populated cities like Rome. And the Insuli, with their flimsy construction and lack of firefighting equipment, were particularly vulnerable. Imagine, a cooking fire gets out of control. A lamp is knocked over. In seconds, the flames spread through the building, engulfing the wooden beams and thatched roofs. Panic ensues. People scramble to escape, but the narrow stairways become choked with desperate bodies. And if you're on the upper floors? Well, your chances of survival are slim. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which Nero famously blamed on the Christians, destroyed a significant portion of the city and left countless people homeless. While the fire wasn't solely confined to the Insuli, it highlighted the vulnerability of these buildings and the precariousness of life in ancient Rome. Speaking of Nero, historians still argue whether he actually fiddled while Rome burned. It's one of those historical anecdotes that has become deeply ingrained in our collective imagination, even though the truth may be far more complex. Living in an insula was, in many ways, a gamble. You were betting on your health, your safety, and your sanity. You were trading comfort and privacy for affordability and opportunity. And sometimes, you lost. Despite the drawbacks, the Insuli were a vital part of Roman urban life. They provided housing for the vast majority of the city's population, and they contributed to the vibrant, chaotic energy of ancient Rome. They were a symbol of both the ingenuity and the inequality of the Roman Empire. So, next time you're complaining about your cramped apartment or your noisy neighbors, just remember the Insuli. Remember the dark stairwells, the lack of privacy, and the ever-present threat of fire. Suddenly, your life doesn't seem so bad, does it? And now, finally, time for you to close your eyes. Good night. And try not to dream of chamber pots. Alright, settle in, because today we're diving headfirst, metaphorically, of course, into the rather murky world of water and sanitation in ancient Roman apartments. Now, before you start imagining pristine marble fountains and sparkling aqueducts, let's just say reality was a bit more rustic. Think less Instagrammable spa day, and more medieval camping trip in a crowded city. Ready? Let's go. So, you're waking up in your insula, or apartment building, probably with the gentle cacophony of the city already underway. Roosters crowing, yes, even in the city, vendors hawking their wares, maybe a disgruntled neighbor yelling about something or other through the thin walls. Fun times. But before you even think about that morning espresso, I mean, mulsum, that spiced wine Romans were so fond of, you're facing the first challenge of the day, procuring water. Unless you're living in the really fancy apartments, the kind with their own plumbing, which, let's be honest, you probably aren't, you're going to have to trudge down to the nearest public fountain. Think of it as your daily pilgrimage to the water cooler, except the cooler is made of stone and probably has a suspicious film on top. Public fountains were a vital part of Roman life, fed by those magnificent aqueducts that you've probably seen pictures of. These aqueducts, by the way, were seriously impressive feats of engineering. The Aqua Appia, built in 312 BCE, was Rome's first. Can you imagine, over 2,000 years ago? You're lugging your amphora, or maybe a bucket if you're feeling particularly modern, and jostling for space with everyone else in your neighborhood. Everyone needs water for cooking, cleaning, and, well, drinking. Hope you're prepared for a little elbow-to-elbow action. Historians still argue whether access to these public fountains was truly equal. Did wealthier Romans have an easier time getting water, maybe sending their slaves to cut the line? Probably. Human nature hasn't changed that much in 2 millennia. And the water itself? Let's just say it wasn't Evian. It was coming from an aqueduct, sure, but those aqueducts also ran through fields, near cemeteries, and past who knows what else. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you might find an enterprising vendor selling filtered water. It was usually just water strained through a cloth, but hey, at least they were trying. Maybe. Now, let's talk sanitation. This is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean slightly horrifying. Inside your insula, you most likely didn't have a private toilet. Can you imagine? You have to head to a communal latrine. Think of a public restroom, but with more marble and less toilet paper. Yes, you heard that right. No toilet paper. Instead, you were using a tersorium, which was essentially a sponge on a stick shared by everyone. Delightful, isn't it? You might be thinking, EW. Well, sometimes the tersorium would be washed in a bucket of saltwater between uses. So, only mildly ew. These public latrines were surprisingly social places. People would chat, conduct business, and generally hang out while, doing their business. I guess it's the Roman version of the office water cooler. Hey, Marcus, how's the olive harvest going this year? Oh, the usual. Say, is that tersorium free? The Roman Emperor Claudius reportedly considered banning farting during these sessions. Now, that would have been a difficult law to enforce. But the real kicker is waste disposal, especially in the upper floors of those multi-story insulae. Remember, Rome was a densely populated city. Getting waste from the top floor to the bottom was problematic. So, what did you do? Well, you had a chamber pot. And then? You threw it out the window. Cave canem. Beware of the dog, was a common warning cry, but perhaps it should have been, cave excrementum. Beware of the, well, you get the idea. It was not uncommon for passers-by to get an unexpected shower of, let's just call it, organic matter. And there were actually laws against this. You were supposed to shout a warning before emptying your chamber pot. But, people being people, sometimes they forgot. Or maybe they just didn't care. Imagine walking through Rome on your way to get some delicious figs, and you get splattered with something unidentifiable. Ah, city life. Now, here's the really juicy bit. Historians still debate the extent to which this affected public health. Did the lack of proper sanitation lead to widespread disease and shorter lifespans? Almost certainly. But the exact impact is difficult to quantify. We do know that Rome experienced periodic outbreaks of disease. Malaria, dysentery, and various other nasties were common. And, let's be honest, the water and sanitation situation didn't exactly help. Of course, the wealthy Romans lived a bit differently. They had private toilets that flushed into sewers. They had slaves to fetch their water and clean up their messes. They could afford better quality food and access to doctors. Basically, they were living in a completely different world. It's always the same, isn't it? And even with all of these inconveniences, with the water shortages and public bathroom visits, life went on. People fell in love, argued, negotiated, and lived their lives. Because at the end of the day, you're going to find a way, even if you have to dodge human waste falling from the heavens. So, the next time you turn on the tap and get clear water, or flush your toilet without a second thought, take a moment to appreciate just how good you have it. Those Romans were tough, resourceful, and probably smelled faintly of, well, never mind. Just be grateful for modern plumbing. And maybe carry an umbrella, just in case you ever invent a time machine. Right, so, you've just schlepped up those stairs, dodging chamber pots and stray cats, and now you're finally standing in your Roman apartment. Take a deep breath, well, maybe not too deep, depending on your neighbors, shall we say, waste disposal habits. What awaits you inside largely depends on how deep your pockets are. Let's get the lay of the land, shall we? If you're part of the plebs, the common folk, your furniture situation is likely to be minimalist, to put it mildly. Think Spartan, but without the fancy military discipline. We're talking bare essentials, folks. You trudge in, kicking off your sandals, hopefully inside and not into the already questionable hallway, and you're greeted by, well, not much. A bed, or rather, a place to sleep is the priority. This probably isn't some plush, Tempur-Pedic situation. Picture a simple wooden frame, maybe with woven rope supporting a straw-filled mattress. Luxury would be adding a thin wool blanket. Scratchy. Very scratchy. You'll be dreaming of sheep, or rather, itching of sheep all night. And hope you don't have allergies. Seriously, I'm getting itchy just thinking about it. You might have a small, three-legged table. Wobbly, of course. Perfect for a quick meal of bread and maybe some olives. Or, if you're feeling fancy, some pulse, a kind of grain porridge. It's not exactly Michelin star material, but hey, it fills the belly, right? This table could also double as a workspace if you're a craftsperson, maybe for mending nets if you're a fisherman, living very far from the sea, somehow, because rent is a killer even back then, or shaping pottery. Speaking of storage, forget walk-in closets. We're talking a simple wooden chest, maybe tucked under the bed. This is where you'd keep your clothes, a tunic, maybe a spare, and a cloak for when the Roman summer decides to take a break. And, of course, any valuables you might own. Which, let's be honest, probably doesn't amount to much more than a few sestertii and a lucky knucklebone. Yes, they used knucklebones for games, like ancient dice. Don't gamble them all away. Lighting? Olive oil lamps. These things were basically glorified teacups filled with oil and a wick. Smoky, smelly, and not exactly bright enough to read by, unless you're really, really squinting. Fire was a constant hazard, too, so you probably went to bed early. Not that you had much choice, given the scratchy blanket and the gnawing feeling that a rat was eyeing your toes. Historians still argue whether the average Roman apartment dweller had any decorative items at all. A small terracotta figure of a household god, perhaps? A simple garland of flowers? Maybe a child's toy? Or were they literally surrounded by nothing but the bare necessities? You can picture some poor guy trying to feng shui his hovel, rearranging the one stool he owns to maximize the good vibes. Now, let's say you're a bit higher up the social ladder. You're not exactly living the life of a senator in a sprawling villa, but you're not scraping the bottom of the barrel either. Your apartment, while still not palatial, shows a little more flair. And hopefully fewer rats. Your bed is still probably made of wood, but it's more solid, and maybe even has some decorative carvings. The mattress is still straw-filled, but you might have a couple of cushions to soften things up. A proper woolen blanket is definitely on the cards. You might even have a bed cover, maybe dyed a vibrant color like purple, which was super trendy, and expensive. Imagine having that. All the other tenants will be jealous. Instead of a wobbly three-legged table, you've got a proper rectangular one, maybe made of oak or even imported wood. You might even have a couple of chairs to go with it, instead of just sitting on the floor. Progress. On the table, you might find some nicer pottery for serving food, maybe even some imported from Gaul. Ooh la la. Storage is getting an upgrade too. Instead of just one chest, you might have a couple, maybe even a small cupboard for storing food. And instead of just stuffing your clothes into a chest, you might have a separate chest for your nicer garments, maybe even perfumed with lavender to keep the moths away. Romans were surprisingly into personal hygiene, despite the whole communal sponge on a stick thing at the public baths. Seriously, Google it. I dare you. Lighting is still olive oil lamps, but you might have a few more, and they might be made of bronze instead of terracotta. And you might have a lampstand to hold them, so you don't have to worry about accidentally knocking them over and setting the whole place on fire. Remember that fire that burned down half the city? Yeah, let's not repeat that. And now for the real luxuries. You might have some wall paintings, simple geometric designs, or maybe even scenes from mythology. Nothing too extravagant, mind you, but enough to add a bit of personality to the place. You might have some decorative statues, too, maybe a small bronze figurine of a god or goddess. You have good taste. You see, even if you weren't rolling in denarii, Romans still appreciated a bit of beauty in their lives. You might have a mosaic floor, made of small colored tiles. Not the elaborate mosaics you see in the villas of the rich, but still, a mosaic. To brighten up those early morning trips to the latrine. That's commitment. And let's not forget about the most important accessory of all, cushions. Romans loved cushions. They would pile them on their couches, on their chairs, even on the floor. Cushions were a status symbol, a sign that you were comfortable and relaxed. The ancient equivalent of those throw pillows everyone has that you're not actually allowed to touch. One quirky Roman habit was the use of lararium, or household shrines. These were small altars dedicated to the family's guardian deities, the Lares and Penates. You would make offerings to them, like food or wine, to ensure good luck and protection for your family. They were basically the Roman version of a good luck charm. Or maybe a religious security blanket. Now, while most of your furniture would be made of wood, the wealthy Romans sometimes used bronze, marble, or even ivory for their furniture. Imagine having an ivory table. You could basically buy a small island with that kind of money. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some historians believe that wealthy Romans used heated floors, known as hypocausts, in their apartments, not just in their villas. Talk about toasty toes. Imagine walking into your apartment on a cold winter day and feeling the warmth radiating from the floor. That's living. But regardless of your wealth, your Roman apartment was your home. It was where you slept, ate, and spent time with your family. It was where you lived your life, in all its messy, chaotic, and sometimes smelly glory. And while it might not have been luxurious by modern standards, it was still your own little slice of ancient Rome. And honestly, that's pretty cool. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk about Roman food. Forget those images of opulent banquets with peacocks and dormice stuffed with walnuts. We're going down to the Insula, the apartment block, where most Romans really lived. Imagine a towering structure, several stories high, maybe even illegally so if the landlord was feeling particularly rebellious against building codes, which, let's be honest, they probably were. These were, shall we say, cozy living arrangements. You trudge up the rickety wooden stairs. There's a definite aroma, a complex bouquet of stale urine, wood smoke, and something vaguely vegetable. Oh, and a top note of whatever the guy upstairs decided to toss out his window this morning. The air is thick, a palpable presence. You reach your apartment, maybe one room, maybe two if you're relatively well off, and step inside. It's cramped, dimly lit, and probably not winning any awards for interior design. Think minimalist, but not by choice. More like minimalist because you can barely afford the bare essentials. The year is, let's say, 100 AD. Trajan is emperor, Rome is booming, and you are, well, you're trying to figure out what's for dinner. Now, you're not exactly starting from scratch. You didn't have to hunt a wild boar with a pointy stick this morning, thankfully. Instead, you venture back out into the bustling, chaotic streets. The noise is incredible. Cartwheels rumble over the cobblestones, vendors hawk their wares with lungs that could rival a modern-day auctioneer, and people shout and argue in that uniquely Roman way that seems both incredibly dramatic and utterly mundane at the same time. It's basically the ancient Roman equivalent of Times Square, if Times Square were also a giant open-air market and everyone was potentially carrying a gladius. You weave your way through the throng, dodging stray dogs and the occasional overly enthusiastic donkey cart driver. Today, you're after some essentials. First stop, a thermopolium. Think of it as the Roman version of a fast food joint, except instead of greasy burgers, they're serving up hot snacks and ready-to-eat meals. These were wildly popular, especially for those of us without fancy kitchens in their insulae. You eye the selection, maybe some pulse, a kind of grain porridge, or perhaps some sausages simmering in a savory broth. The aroma alone is enough to make your stomach rumble. Historians still argue whether these were purely for the lower classes or if even wealthier Romans frequented them when they were too lazy to cook. My personal theory? Laziness transcends social classes. You pick up a portion of pulse, cheap, filling, and surprisingly palatable with a little bit of olive oil and maybe some herbs if you're feeling fancy. Next, you head to a fruit and vegetable vendor. The stalls are piled high with seasonal produce, figs, grapes, apples, maybe some leeks or onions. You haggle for a few coins, because, let's face it, every sestertius counts. While you're there, you notice a vendor selling garum. Ah, garum. That pungent, fermented fish sauce that the Romans seemed to put on everything. It's basically the ancient Roman version of ketchup, only instead of tomatoes, it's made from, well, let's just say it involves fish guts and a whole lot of sunshine. It's an acquired taste. Fun fact, the production of garum was often located outside city centers because the smell was so incredibly overpowering. Can't imagine why. You decide to pass on the garum today. Maybe tomorrow you'll feel brave. Or maybe not. Instead, you grab a loaf of bread from a nearby bakery. Roman bread was generally pretty coarse, made from whole wheat flour, but it was a staple. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you might even find a stray olive baked inside. Bonus! Back in your apartment, it's time to cook. Cook might be a generous term. You're not exactly Julia Child here. Most Insula apartments had limited or no kitchen facilities. Open flames were a major fire hazard, and with so many people packed into such close quarters, a single spark could turn into a full-blown inferno in minutes. This led to all sorts of building regulations, though, as we mentioned, they weren't always followed to the letter. Instead of a proper stove, you likely have a small brazier or portable oven, basically a charcoal-burning contraption. It's smoky, inefficient, and probably slowly poisoning you with carbon monoxide, but hey, at least it's warm. You carefully arrange the charcoal and light it, trying not to set your already threadbare tunic on fire. The smoke fills the room almost instantly, stinging your eyes and making you cough. Ventilation? What ventilation? The open window offers a little relief, but also lets in the sounds and smells of the street below. It's a trade-off. You heat up your pulse, maybe add a few chopped vegetables, and call it dinner. Congratulations, you've officially recreated a typical Roman apartment meal. But hold on, what about meat? Ah, meat. That was a luxury for most Insula dwellers. You might occasionally be able to afford some cheap cuts of pork or chicken, but beef was generally reserved for the wealthier classes. Instead, you relied on things like beans, lentils, and other legumes for protein. And, of course, the occasional insect that might accidentally wander into your food. Hey, extra protein. Now, here's a quirky tidbit for you. Archaeological digs have revealed evidence of dormice being consumed in Roman times. They would catch them, fatten them up and eat them like delicacies. After your gourmet meal, you probably wouldn't be doing the dishes. Dishes were washed when they got too gross to ignore or when the neighbors started complaining. You'd likely just wipe your bowl clean with a piece of bread and call it a night. And maybe say a quick prayer to the gods that your building doesn't spontaneously combust before morning. So, there you have it. A glimpse into the everyday culinary life of a Roman living in an apartment. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was a life filled with the smells of street food, the sounds of a bustling city, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. It was a life where a simple loaf of bread could be a treasure, and a shared meal with friends or family was a true celebration. And who knows, maybe tomorrow you'll finally try that garum. Or maybe you'll just stick with the pulse. Sweet dreams, friend, and sleep tight. Don't let the bedbugs bite. That's a little anachronistic. They probably had fleas. Sleep tight, don't let the fleas bite. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk about noise. You know, that constant companion that follows you around even when you just want 5 minutes of blessed silence. Multiply that by, oh, I don't know, 1,000, and then throw in a bunch of people yelling in Latin, and you've got a pretty good idea of what it was like to navigate the soundscape of ancient Rome. Imagine this: you're waking up. Not to the gentle chirping of birds, unless you happen to live in a ridiculously posh villa on the outskirts of the city, and let's be honest, statistically speaking, you probably don't. No, you're jolted awake by the cacophony that is already building outside your window. And let me tell you, those Roman windows weren't exactly double-paned, were they? More like a decorative hole in the wall. The first thing you hear is the rumble of carts. Heavy, wooden-wheeled carts, grinding their way down the cobblestone streets, laden with goods for the market. These aren't your modern, rubber-tired delivery trucks. Think more Flintstone-esque. And those cobblestones? Not exactly known for their noise-dampening properties. Each bump and jolt sends vibrations straight through your skull. It's enough to make you swear off breakfast, which, trust me, is a big deal because Roman breakfasts were basically just bread dipped in wine. Who would want to skip that? Accompanying the carts is the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves. Horses, mules, maybe even the occasional donkey, all pulling their weight in this bustling urban ballet. And the drovers? Well, they're not exactly known for their quiet encouragement. Expect a constant stream of shouts, curses, and general equine motivational speeches. It's a symphony of chaos, really. Now, add to that the human element. Vendors are setting up shop, hawking their wares with voices that could rival a foghorn. Fresh bread. Get your fresh bread here. Finest olives in all of Rome. Come and get M. Pottery. Guaranteed not to break, probably. They're all competing for your attention, creating a verbal free-for-all that makes your local farmer's market sound like a monastery. And it's not just the vendors. The streets are teeming with people. People arguing, people gossiping, people singing off-key, because, let's face it, not everyone in ancient Rome was Pavarotti. You've got children playing games, their shrieks of laughter adding another layer to the already deafening chorus. Historians still argue whether the Romans had a concept of personal space, but given the sheer density of population, I'm guessing it was a pretty theoretical concept. Think sardines in a toga. Then there's the construction. Rome was constantly under construction. Buildings were being erected, demolished, and renovated at a seemingly perpetual rate. So, you've got the clang of hammers, the scraping of saws, the shouts of construction workers, all blending together into a dissonant orchestra of urban development. Imagine living next to a never-ending home renovation project. That was basically life in ancient Rome. And let's not forget the animals. Dogs barking, chickens clucking, the occasional exotic bird squawking its displeasure at being dragged all the way from, well, wherever exotic birds came from back then. Pliny the Elder, that chronicler of all things Roman, even mentions peacocks being kept as pets. Can you imagine? A peacock screeching outside your window at 5 a.m.? I'd be tempted to use it in my next stew. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds pretty awful. But surely there were some quiet corners in Rome, right? Well, maybe. If you were ridiculously wealthy and could afford a villa with soundproof walls, which, spoiler alert, didn't exist, you might find some respite. Or if you were a Vestal virgin, sworn to silence and living in a secluded temple. But for the average Roman citizen, noise was simply a fact of life. The constant noise had to have an effect. I mean, even today, noise pollution is linked to stress, anxiety, and a whole host of other health problems. So, what was it like for the Romans? Did they develop coping mechanisms? Did they simply become desensitized to the din? Or were they all secretly plotting to move to the countryside and become shepherds? There's some evidence that they did try to address the problem, at least in some ways. Laws were passed regulating the hours during which certain noisy activities could take place. For example, chariot racing, a huge source of noise, naturally, was often restricted to certain times of day. And some emperors even attempted to limit the movement of heavy carts during the night, although, let's be honest, how well that was enforced is anyone's guess. The Romans, despite their impressive engineering feats and sophisticated legal system, didn't have earplugs. Can you imagine trying to find a moment of peace without the ability to block out all that noise? You'd probably end up just yelling louder than everyone else to make yourself heard. Which, ironically, would only add to the problem. One quirky tidbit is the existence of apartment blocks in Rome, known as insulae. These multi-story buildings housed a large proportion of the city's population, and they were notoriously cramped and noisy. Imagine living on the 6th floor of an insula, with all the sounds of the city rising up to your tiny, windowless room. It's enough to make you appreciate your modern apartment, even if your upstairs neighbor does enjoy practicing the tuba at 3 a.m. It's interesting to think about how the soundscape of a city shapes its culture. The Romans, surrounded by constant noise, were known for their boisterousness and their love of public spectacle. Maybe the noise actually fueled their extroverted personalities. Or maybe they were just all slightly deaf. Now, let's get slightly philosophical for a moment. What does it mean to live in a world saturated with noise? We're so used to it that we barely even notice it anymore. The hum of traffic, the buzz of electronics, the constant chatter of social media, it's all just background noise. But maybe, just maybe, we're missing out on something by not experiencing true silence. Maybe there's a certain wisdom to be found in the absence of sound. Or, maybe I'm just getting a little too sleepy. But honestly, thinking about the constant noise of ancient Rome makes me appreciate the relatively quiet hum of my own apartment. Although, I should probably apologize to my downstairs neighbors for last night's attempt at playing the recorder. Historians still debate whether the Romans actually enjoyed the noise. Some argue that they were simply accustomed to it and that it was part of the vibrant energy of city life. Others suggest that they were constantly stressed and irritable, desperately longing for a quiet retreat. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. One mainstream historical fact we know is that Rome's population during its peak was estimated to be around 1 million people. That's a lot of people crammed into a relatively small area. And a lot of mouths to feed, voices to raise, and feet to shuffle through the streets. It's no wonder the city was so noisy. So, next time you find yourself complaining about the noise in your own life, take a moment to imagine what it would have been like to live in ancient Rome. The constant rumble of carts, the shouts of vendors, the clang of hammers, the barking of dogs, it was a sensory overload, a symphony of chaos, a testament to the vibrant, messy, and undeniably noisy life of the ancient Romans. And maybe, just maybe, you'll appreciate the relative peace and quiet of your own little corner of the world. Or, at the very least, you'll have a good excuse to invest in some noise-canceling headphones. Because let's be honest, a little bit of silence can go a long way. Even if the Romans didn't have that luxury. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go find a quiet corner and try to drown out the sound of my own thoughts. It's almost as noisy as ancient Rome in here. Did they have therapists back then? Just wondering. Okay, settle in, friend. Let's talk about the things that bump in the night, specifically, when those bumps are less mischievous spirits and more, well, crime. And safety. Or, perhaps more accurately, the lack of safety, especially when you're just trying to exist in your humble apartment abode. You trudge home after a long day, the city lights blurring slightly as exhaustion tugs at your eyelids. Your feet ache, your brain feels like scrambled eggs, and all you want is to collapse onto your couch with a questionable reality TV show. But the walk home, that walk home is its own special kind of gauntlet, isn't it? Each shadow seems a little deeper, each sudden noise a little louder. You clutch your keys a little tighter, mentally rehearsing that pepper spray technique you saw on YouTube. You swear you'll actually buy pepper spray one of these days, right after you remember to buy milk. It's funny, isn't it, how we've supposedly advanced so much as a society, yet the basic human fear of being mugged in a dark alley persists. Back in the Roman Empire, I'm talking way back, like Julius Caesar's salad days, they actually had organized firefighting and policing, called the vigiles. Can you imagine? Actual, state-sponsored dudes running around with buckets and telling people to keep the noise down. And here you are, in the 21st century, hoping your apartment's flimsy deadbolt is enough to deter a determined intruder. I mean, who are we kidding? It's probably easier to kick in the door than navigate the labyrinthine online lease agreement. The history of urban crime is, well, it's basically the history of cities themselves. Where there's concentrated wealth and population, there's going to be someone trying to take what isn't theirs. It's a sad truth, but a truth nonetheless. Historians still argue whether the invention of the printing press led to an increase in crime reporting, thereby appearing to increase crime, or if it actually exacerbated societal ills through the spread of inflammatory pamphlets, I guess. It's like the 15th century version of Twitter, only with more parchment and fewer cat memes. And speaking of technology, you think security cameras are everywhere, right? Providing this constant, watchful eye. Well, maybe in the affluent parts of town. In your neighborhood, the only surveillance you might get is from Mrs. Henderson across the street, peering through her blinds with binoculars she probably got from a cereal box. Bless her heart. You finally reach your building, fumbling for your keys again. The entryway light is flickering, of course. It's always flickering. You've reported it to management 3 times, but they're probably too busy counting all the rent money to, maintain the building. Each step up the creaky stairs feels like it's announcing your arrival to every potential evildoer within a 5-block radius. Seriously, these stairs sound like they're auditioning for a horror movie. Then there's the apartment door. Oh, the apartment door. It's probably made of plywood and good intentions. The deadbolt looks, well, it looks decorative, mostly. It might slow someone down for a few seconds, maybe give you enough time to grab a frying pan. Or maybe just enough time to question all your life choices that led you to this moment. The thing about apartment living is that you're inherently reliant on the security measures put in place by someone else. You trust that the landlord has done their due diligence in screening tenants, that the building's exterior doors are secure, that the security system, if there is a security system, actually works. But let's be real. How often do you see the front door propped open? How many times have you followed someone into the building without them even glancing at you? And the buzzer system? It's more of a suggestion than a security measure. You might as well just yell, "Come on in, stranger." It's a gamble, really. You're gambling that the building's security measures are adequate, that your neighbors are trustworthy, and that the general level of criminality in your area is low enough that you won't become a statistic. It's a comforting thought, right? Almost as comforting as realizing that the smoke detector in your apartment has been chirping for 3 weeks and you haven't bothered to replace the battery. Priorities, people. Priorities. Remember the Great Molasses Flood of 1919? In Boston, a giant tank of molasses burst, sending a sticky, sweet tsunami through the streets. People died. Horses died. It was a bizarre and tragic event. What does this have to do with apartment security? Absolutely nothing, except to illustrate that life is unpredictable and sometimes you just get swept away by a wave of, well, not molasses, hopefully. But a wave of, unfortunate circumstances. Maybe it's a robbery. Maybe it's a noisy neighbor. Maybe it's a persistent dripping faucet that drives you slowly insane. You finally get the door unlocked, practically collapsing inside. Home sweet slightly less than secure home. You flick on the lights, instantly feeling a little safer. A little. You glance around, checking for any signs of forced entry. Nope. Everything seems normal. Which is both a relief and slightly unsettling. Shouldn't there be a parade or something after surviving another day in the big city? Of course, even inside your apartment, you're not entirely safe. You've got fire hazards, faulty wiring, and the ever-present threat of dust bunnies. Let's not forget the lurking dangers of old food in the fridge. Seriously, that science experiment in the back could probably gain sentience any day now. Now, some people would say you're being paranoid. That the chances of something actually happening are slim. And statistically, they might be right. But statistics don't exactly offer much comfort when you're lying awake at night, listening to every creak and groan of the building. That's when your imagination starts to run wild. Is that the wind rattling the window, or is someone trying to pry it open? Is that just the cat knocking something over, or is it the sound of breaking glass? Historians still argue whether anxiety existed before the 20th century, or if people were just too busy dying of dysentery to worry about existential dread. I'm leaning towards the former. There are things you can do, of course. You can invest in a better deadbolt. You can get a security system. You can befriend your neighbors. You can even take a self-defense class, although personally, I'd probably just trip and fall on my attacker. But in the end, it all comes down to being aware of your surroundings and trusting your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The truth is, apartment security is a constant balancing act. You want to feel safe, but you also don't want to live in a fortress. You want to be trusting, but you also don't want to be naive. You want to relax, but you also don't want to let your guard down completely. It's exhausting, isn't it? I'm getting sleepy just thinking about it. It's a little-known fact that during World War II, people in London would paint their windows black to comply with blackout regulations. Talk about a security measure. Imagine trying to navigate your apartment in complete darkness every night. On the plus side, it would probably deter burglars. On the downside, you'd probably break every toe in your body. You sink onto the couch, finally. You grab the remote, ready to lose yourself in the comforting glow of the television. But even as you flip through channels, you can't quite shake that lingering feeling of unease. The city outside is still humming, a constant reminder that you're not alone. Not entirely. Maybe it's time to invest in a really good nightlight. And some pepper spray. And maybe a moat. Okay, the moat might be a bit excessive. But hey, a girl can dream, right? Just remember to lock the door behind you, friend. You never know what lurks in the shadows, or in apartment 3B. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I hear something. Could be the cat, could be the fridge, could be, well, never mind. Stay safe out there. And, try to get some sleep. Alright, settle in, pull up a metaphorical cushion, and let's chat about Roman apartment living. Forget sprawling villas with meticulously manicured gardens, we're diving headfirst into the Insula, the Roman apartment block. Picture this, you trudge along a bustling, noisy street in ancient Rome. The air, thick with the smells of charcoal smoke, roasting meat, maybe some dormice if you're feeling fancy, and, well, let's just say sanitation wasn't exactly a strong suit. You glance up. Looming above the shops that line the street, packed tight against each other like panicked sardines, is the Insula. These weren't exactly luxury condos. In fact, they were often hastily and shoddily built, prone to collapse, and fire was a constant threat. Not exactly the live, laugh, love aesthetic, is it? You might think that everyone inside was miserable together, but hold your horses. The Insula was a microcosm of Roman society, a vertical slice of social stratification. And you, my friend, get to explore all its levels. The ground floor, as usual, is where the action is. You hear the clatter and banter of shops spilling out onto the street. These spaces were prime real estate, rented out to taberni, the small shops and workshops that kept the city humming. Bakers knead dough, blacksmiths hammer away at metal, and barbers sharpen their razors, all vying for your attention, and your sestertii. The ground floor was the place to be if you wanted to be seen, to be part of the vibrant, sometimes chaotic, pulse of Roman life. And frankly, if you have the cash, it's the place you want to be. Above you, however, the social ladder begins to creak a little. The second floor, if you were lucky enough to snag a place here, was generally the most desirable residential space. It often offered the best balance between accessibility, fewer stairs to climb, and decent living conditions. These apartments, called sonacula, would likely have multiple rooms, maybe even a latrina, a private toilet. Think of it as the Park Avenue of the Insula. If the Insula was really fancy, you might even have mosaics. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like you're lounging in a jacuzzi with a chilled glass of Falernian, but it was definitely a step up from the cramped, noisy street level. Climbing further, the air gets thinner, the stairs steeper, and the quality of life, well, it takes a noticeable dip. The higher you go, the smaller and more cramped the apartments become. You start to notice the lack of natural light, the musty smell clinging to the walls. Water access gets more challenging, and let's not even talk about the trek down to the communal latrines. These upper floors were often subdivided into even smaller rooms, housing the poorer residents of Rome, laborers, freedmen, and sometimes even slaves. Historians still argue whether landlords were maliciously greedy or simply pragmatic in packing as many people as possible into these spaces. It's easy to picture families crammed into tiny spaces, struggling to make ends meet, their lives a stark contrast to the relative comfort enjoyed by those on the lower floors. Imagine sharing a single room with your family, cooking on a small charcoal brazier, the smoke filling the already stuffy space. Privacy? Forget about it. Quiet? A distant dream. Your neighbors include everyone from the local sandal maker to a rather noisy family of textile merchants. And the noise. The constant din of the city rises, amplified by the narrow streets and the echoing walls of the Insula. You hear the shouts of vendors, the rumble of carts, the barking of dogs, and the ever-present gossip of your neighbors. It's a symphony of urban chaos, played at full volume, all day and all night. You'd kill for some noise-canceling headphones, wouldn't you? The top floors, the attic spaces directly under the roof, were the absolute bottom of the barrel. These were the cheapest and most undesirable apartments, often poorly constructed and exposed to the elements. In the summer, they would be stiflingly hot, in the winter, freezing cold. Rainwater leaked through the roof, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. But for those who couldn't afford anything better, it was a roof over their heads, barely. Imagine having to climb those rickety wooden stairs every single day. Your calves would be on fire. Forget about a stairmaster, just move into the Roman Empire. Now, here's a slightly quirky tidbit, there's evidence that some insulae had their own resident ghosts. Seriously. While Romans were generally pretty practical, they were also deeply superstitious. They believed in household spirits called Lares and Penates, and the idea of a restless soul haunting a building wasn't exactly out of the realm of possibility. Maybe it was the ghost of a builder who fell to his death, or a resident who died under mysterious circumstances. Who knows? Makes climbing those creaky stairs a little more interesting, doesn't it? And yes, I know, some people also swear that modern apartment blocks have ghosts. So, in a way, insulae are still with us. Of course, the social stratification within the insula wasn't just about physical comfort. It also reflected differences in wealth, status, and occupation. Those on the lower floors were more likely to be involved in commerce and trade, while those on the upper floors were more likely to be laborers, artisans, or even unemployed. The insula, in other words, was a microcosm of the vast inequalities that existed in Roman society. The insula also brings up an interesting question: how did people from different social classes interact within the same building? Did they socialize? Did they help each other out? Or did they simply ignore each other, living separate lives within the same four walls? It's likely that there was a mix of both. While there may have been some sense of community among residents, particularly those on the same floor, social barriers undoubtedly existed. After all, Roman society was highly hierarchical, and those divisions would have played out even within the confines of the insula. Here's something that might make you pause and ponder. Some scholars propose that insulae, due to their dense population and sometimes precarious construction, could have been hotbeds for social unrest. Imagine the frustration and resentment of those living in cramped, uncomfortable conditions, while those on the lower floors enjoyed relative luxury. It's not hard to see how tensions could have flared up, potentially leading to riots or other forms of social protest. It's a good thing that never happened, right? Oh, wait. It did. There were indeed examples of civil unrest and fires starting in the Insula. This is probably because the wood used to build the Insula was dried in a kiln for as little time as possible in order to get these up as quickly as possible. The ancient Romans were not known for building high-quality apartment blocks, and this caused collapses and fires. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the lack of one in the Insula: sanitation. Or, more accurately, the lack of sanitation. As you can imagine, with so many people living in close proximity, waste disposal was a major problem. Communal latrines were often overcrowded and unsanitary, and many residents simply threw their waste out the window, hence the phrase, "watch your step." And here's where things get interesting. One fringe theory suggests that Romans developed a peculiar sense of humor about their unsanitary conditions. Think of it as a coping mechanism. They would make jokes about the smells, the overflowing latrines, and the general messiness of urban life. It was a way of diffusing the tension and finding some levity in what was, let's face it, a pretty grim situation. I guess you could say they were masters of dark humor, literally. One might even say they had a crappy sense of humor, but then again, some jokes just write themselves. The Insula, then, wasn't just a building, it was a living, breathing entity, a complex ecosystem of human lives. It was a place of commerce, a place of residence, and a place where the social divisions of Roman society were laid bare. So, next time you're stuck in traffic, or waiting in line at the grocery store, take a moment to imagine life in an ancient Roman insula. It might just make you appreciate your modern conveniences a little bit more. Or at least be glad you don't have to share a latrine with your entire building. Good night. Okay, settle in, because we're about to time travel. And no, I don't have a DeLorean or a TARDIS, just a hefty dose of imagination and the remarkably well-preserved ruins of Ostia Antica. Think of it as Pompeii, but without all the, instantly petrified residents. Close your eyes for a second. Okay, maybe don't close them entirely, you need to read this. But imagine you're stepping off a creaky dock. The air is thick with the briny tang of the Tyrrhenian Sea and, something else. A less pleasant aroma, shall we say. Centuries of fish guts and uncollected garbage kind of leave a mark, historically speaking. You hear the cries of gulls overhead and the shouts of stevedores unloading cargo from merchant ships. Welcome to Ostia Antica, the ancient port of Rome, circa the 2nd century AD. You trudge through the sandy streets, which, by the way, would have been teeming with life. Romans weren't exactly known for their aversion to crowds. Think of Times Square on New Year's Eve, only swap out the ball drop for the occasional toga-clad politician trying to bribe voters with cheap wine. And replace the selfie sticks with, well, probably just sticks. Now, Ostia wasn't just any port. It was the port. The lifeline of Rome. Everything that fed the empire, grain from North Africa, spices from the east, marble for grand temples, passed through this bustling hub. Remember that phrase, all roads lead to Rome? Well, all ships led to Ostia. It was so vital that if Ostia choked, Rome starved. Seriously, it was that critical. But we're not here for a history lesson, are we? We're here to peek into the everyday lives of the people who called this place home. And that means we need to find an insula. Ah, there's one now. Insula, Latin for island, was basically the Roman equivalent of an apartment building. Think prefab concrete jungle meets ancient ingenuity. These multi-story structures were the housing of choice for the vast majority of Ostians, and Romans in general, who couldn't afford a sprawling villa with its own personal mosaic artist and grape-stomping facilities. You cautiously approach the entrance. It's surprisingly imposing, considering these were built for the less elite. The exterior walls, once plastered and painted, are now mostly bare brick. You can still make out traces of color, though: ochre, red, maybe even a faded blue. Imagine how vibrant this place would have looked when it was new. Like a slightly more durable, ancient version of a South Beach condo. Take a deep breath. Maybe not too deep. We're going inside. The ground floor is typically occupied by shops and taberni, small businesses. You can almost smell the remnants of the baker's oven, feel the oily residue from the olive press, hear the raucous laughter spilling out from the local tavern. These weren't just places to buy goods and services, they were social hubs, where people gathered to gossip, argue about politics, and probably complain about the landlord. Some of these taberni served thermopolia meals, the fast food of the time, usually bean stew or something similar. Some examples discovered even contain duck bones. Now, the apartments themselves. Let's head upstairs, carefully. The stairs are steep and worn, and there's no guarantee that the railing, if there was one, is still intact. Safety standards weren't exactly a top priority back then. Building codes were more like guidelines. The higher you go, the smaller and more cramped the apartments become. Ground floor units might have boasted multiple rooms and even a courtyard. But up here, on the third or fourth floor, you're lucky if you have a single room with a window. You are, to put it gently, living in a closet. And with the risk of collapse, all the more risky. Imagine trying to raise a family in a space smaller than your modern-day walk-in. Sleeping, cooking, eating, everything happens in this one room. Privacy? Forget about it. Personal space? A luxury you can't afford. You're practically living on top of your neighbors, and you can probably hear everything they're doing. Hopefully, they're not practicing the tuba. Speaking of hearing, the noise. The din of the city, the carts rumbling over cobblestones, the vendors hawking their wares, the endless chatter of the crowds, permeates everything. And at night? Well, let's just say that the Romans weren't exactly known for their quiet evenings. Dinner parties, street brawls, the occasional chariot race down the via, it all adds up to a pretty cacophonous experience. And then there's the light, or rather, the lack thereof. These upper-floor apartments are dimly lit, even during the day. The windows, if you're lucky enough to have one, are small and probably covered with oiled cloth or shutters to keep out the elements. And the occasional pigeon. You're relying on oil lamps or candles for illumination, which are expensive and, well, a fire hazard. Which brings us to the real downside of Insula life, the risk of fire. These buildings were primarily constructed of wood and brick, a combustible combination. And with open flames used for cooking and lighting, fires were a common occurrence. A small kitchen mishap could quickly turn into a full-blown inferno, engulfing entire blocks. Imagine the chaos. The screams. The panicked scramble to escape. It was one of the great fears of the urban dweller. Historians still argue whether the insulae were really as dangerous as some accounts suggest. Some believe that the fire risk was overstated, while others point to the numerous historical accounts of devastating fires in Rome and Ostia as evidence of the inherent dangers. Regardless, it's safe to say that fire safety wasn't exactly a selling point for these ancient apartments. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Despite the cramped conditions and the inherent risks, people made these apartments their homes. They decorated the walls with simple frescoes, hung curtains to create a semblance of privacy, and filled the space with their belongings. They cooked meals together, shared stories, and built communities within these vertical villages. And in a way, that's what makes Ostia Antica so fascinating. It's not just a collection of ruins, it's a snapshot of everyday life in the Roman world. It allows you to connect with the people who lived here on a human level, to understand their challenges, their hopes, and their dreams. Did they dream of moving out? Probably. But they were where they were. You see evidence of their lives everywhere you look. A child's toy discarded in a corner. A graffito scratched into a wall, maybe a declaration of love, maybe just someone venting their frustration with the tax collector. A worn-out sandal left behind in a doorway. Each object tells a story, a fragment of a life lived in this ancient city. One quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found evidence of surprisingly sophisticated plumbing systems in some of the insulae. While not every apartment had running water, imagine lugging buckets of water up 4 flights of stairs. Some buildings did have access to toilets and even rudimentary showers. It's easy to romanticize the past, but sometimes hygiene was a priority. And what about the cost? Well, rent varied depending on the location and the size of the apartment. But generally speaking, it was relatively affordable, at least for the lower classes. Think of it as ancient public housing. You weren't exactly living in luxury, but you had a roof over your head and a place to call your own. Speaking of taxes, here's a light joke: why did the Roman Empire fall? Because it tripped over all the unpaid taxes. Or, maybe it was something else. But I bet taxes had something to do with it. So, as you wander through the ruins of Ostia Antica, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity and resilience of the people who lived here. They may not have had all the modern conveniences we take for granted, but they created a vibrant and thriving community in the heart of the Roman Empire. And they did it all in apartments that were, let's be honest, a bit of a fire hazard. Alright, welcome back, settle in, maybe grab a blanket because, you know, history can be surprisingly cozy. Today, we're diving headfirst, carefully, of course, into the world of Roman apartments. Not the kind with togas and fountains, although, wouldn't that be nice, but the real deal, the bustling, sometimes grimy, and occasionally terrifying reality of urban living in ancient Rome. We're going to see how it stacks up, literally, sometimes 8 stories high, against our own modern apartment experiences. So, picture this: you're strolling down a Roman street, maybe dodging a chariot or two, or, you know, a rogue pigeon. Same difference, really. The air is thick with the aroma of street food, garum, anyone? And the sounds of 1,000 conversations all competing for your attention. But your destination isn't a fancy villa, no, you're heading home to your insula. That's the Roman word for apartment building, and trust me, they were everywhere. Think of them as the ancient world's answer to the brownstone, or maybe the brutalist concrete tower, depending on your luck. You trudge up the stairs, no elevators here, sadly. Each step creaks ominously, and you swear you can feel the building subtly swaying. Remember to watch your step, though. Seneca the Younger, yes, that's Seneca, once complained about the constant noise of the apartments, particularly the sounds of people working, and the potential for a catastrophic collapse. Yikes. The higher you go, the steeper the stairs become and the less natural light you encounter. You might even be able to touch both sides of the stairwell at once, not that you'd want to. The lower floors, naturally, were prime real estate, reserved for the wealthier residents. Think of them as the penthouse suites of their day, albeit without the panoramic city views, unless you count the overflowing sewers. As you finally reach your floor, you fumble with your keys, or rather, your rudimentary lock and key system, which probably wouldn't keep a determined toddler out, let alone a seasoned Roman burglar. You open the door to your apartment. What greets you depends entirely on your social status and, let's be honest, your landlord's generosity. For the average Roman citizen, apartments could be cramped, dark, and seriously lacking in amenities. We're talking 1 or 2 rooms, maybe a small balcony if you were really lucky, and that's about it. Plumbing was, shall we say, communal, and fire was a constant threat. Now, compare that to your own apartment. Do you have central heating? Running water? A functioning fire escape? Probably. And the Romans? Well, they had each other. And a lot of blankets. Historians still argue whether the reliance on charcoal braziers for warmth contributed significantly to air pollution in ancient Rome, but you can bet your bottom sestertius the air quality wasn't great. We're talking about a city that held gladiator games, remember? Fresh air wasn't exactly high on their list of priorities. Did you know that Roman firefighters actually used vinegar to put out fires? Apparently, it was somewhat effective. I wonder if it made the burning buildings smell like salad dressing? And let's talk about the noise. We complain about our noisy neighbors now, but imagine living in an insula with paper-thin walls, or rather, brick-thin walls. You'd hear everything. Babies crying, couples arguing, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith working downstairs at 3 a.m., all the sounds of Roman life, amplified and echoing through your tiny apartment. You might even be able to smell what they were cooking for dinner, which could be a blessing or a curse, depending on their culinary choices. Plus, the lack of soundproofing meant you were essentially living in a constant state of eavesdropping, which, admittedly, could be a valuable source of gossip. But hey, it wasn't all bad. These apartments, despite their shortcomings, fostered a sense of community. You knew your neighbors, you shared the same struggles, like the leaky roof and the ever-present smell of sewage, and you relied on each other for support. In a way, it was like living in a giant, chaotic, slightly dysfunctional family. And let's not forget the location. You were right in the heart of the city, close to the Forum, the Colosseum, and all the other exciting things that Rome had to offer. Forget long commutes, you could walk to work, to the market, even to the public baths, which, by the way, were probably cleaner than your apartment's bathroom. Think about the modern parallels. You might find yourself living in a cramped studio apartment in a bustling city, struggling with the noise, the lack of space, and the ever-increasing rent. But you're also surrounded by culture, by opportunity, and by the energy of urban life. You can walk to your favorite coffee shop, catch a show at the theater, and meet people from all walks of life. It's the same trade-off the Romans made, just with slightly better plumbing and a whole lot more avocado toast. And then there's the issue of cost. In ancient Rome, as in today's major cities, location dictated the price. A ground-floor apartment near the Forum would cost a king's ransom, or, an emperor's ransom. A cramped room on the top floor of a rickety insula in a less desirable neighborhood? Still probably expensive, because hey, it's Rome. Roman real estate was a hot commodity, and landlords were notorious for squeezing every last sestertius out of their tenants. I bet they even had hidden fees. Historians still argue whether rent control existed in ancient Rome, but there's ample evidence to suggest that housing was a significant burden for many citizens. One quirky tidbit? Some insulae even had street-level shops built right into them. Imagine living above a bakery that churned out fresh bread all day long. Tempting, right? Or maybe not so tempting when you consider the early morning noise. Talk about a carb-loaded nightmare. And what about safety? Well, let's just say that security wasn't exactly a top priority. Your front door probably consisted of a flimsy wooden panel with a basic lock. Fire was a constant threat, as we've mentioned. And then there was the risk of collapse. Insulae were often built cheaply and quickly, especially during periods of rapid population growth. This led to some seriously unstable structures, prone to collapsing under their own weight. It's estimated that hundreds of buildings collapsed in Rome every year. Sleep tight. Despite these dangers, people still flocked to Rome, drawn by the opportunities and the excitement of city life. They crammed themselves into these insulae, forming a dense and vibrant urban ecosystem. They adapted to the challenges, found ways to make their small spaces livable, and built communities that thrived despite the hardships. The parallels with today's urban living are striking. We still flock to cities for the same reasons: opportunity, culture, and connection. We still struggle with the same challenges: high rents, cramped spaces, and the constant noise of city life. And we still find ways to adapt, to make our apartments our homes, and to build communities that support us. We still put up with a lot because of the amazing experiences that can be had outside of our living spaces. So, next time you find yourself complaining about your tiny apartment or your noisy neighbors, remember the Romans. They faced the same challenges, perhaps even worse. And yet, they managed to create one of the greatest civilizations in history, all while living in buildings that probably wouldn't pass a modern building inspection. You know, if they had building inspections back then. Now, as the sun sets over our virtual tour of ancient Roman apartments, remember this: whether it's a sprawling villa or a cramped insula, a home is a home. And even if it doesn't have central heating or soundproofing, it's the people inside that truly make it a place to be. Alright, settle in, because now we're going to shift gears and really dig into the so what of all of this cramped, precarious Roman apartment living. After all, what good is a deep dive into ancient insulae if we can't drag some relevant takeaways kicking and screaming into the 21st century? So, dim the lights, maybe light a lavender candle, and let's ponder the legacy of Roman apartment life and the lessons it whispers across the millennia. Let's start with urban planning. Picture this: you're an urban planner in, say, Mumbai or Cairo, grappling with skyrocketing populations and limited space. Sound familiar? The Romans faced a similar dilemma, albeit without the joys of internal combustion engines. They packed people into relatively small areas, and their solution, whether brilliantly conceived or born of sheer desperation, was verticality. They built upwards, creating multi-story dwellings that, despite their many flaws, housed a lot of people. Now, I'm not saying we should just blindly copy the insulae. Imagine building an apartment complex today with wooden beams and open flame cooking on every floor. Your insurance agent would spontaneously combust from sheer terror. But, the Roman experience does highlight the importance of efficient land use, the need for mixed-use development. Remember, shops often occupied the ground floor of insulae, and the crucial role of infrastructure. Think about it: the Romans may have had dodgy plumbing by our standards, but they did have aqueducts, sewers, and public bathhouses. Access to water and sanitation are absolutely essential for any dense urban environment, and the neglect of such basics in many modern cities sadly echoes some of the sanitation-related health crises of ancient Rome. And, dare I say, maybe we could take a leaf out of their book when it comes to public spaces. While the insulae themselves might have been cramped and stuffy, Roman cities also featured public gardens, forums, and theaters, places where people from all walks of life could mingle and relax. Modern cities often prioritize private space and consumption over communal areas, which, I think, can contribute to a sense of isolation and alienation. Imagine your city with a few more public fountains, a few more leafy squares, maybe even a reenactment of a gladiatorial battle in the park every Tuesday? Okay, maybe not that last one. Unless, you know, it's funny. We often think of the Romans as this incredibly advanced civilization, and in many ways, they were. But, then you remember things like the fact that they used lead pipes for their water supply. Talk about a long-term health hazard. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning played a significant role in the decline of the Roman Empire, but it's definitely a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of technological innovation. Just because you can do something, doesn't mean you should. Alright, let's wade into the murky waters of social inequality. Roman apartment life was a stark illustration of the vast gulf between the haves and the have-nots. While the wealthy lived in luxurious villas with courtyards and gardens, the vast majority of the population was crammed into cramped, poorly constructed insulae. This wasn't just a matter of different lifestyles, it was a matter of fundamental inequalities in access to resources, safety, and even basic human dignity. Living in an insula meant dealing with the constant threat of fire, structural collapse, and disease. It meant enduring noise, overcrowding, and a lack of privacy. And, it meant being vulnerable to exploitation by landlords and merchants. It's a sharp reminder that inequality isn't just about income disparity, it's about the differential distribution of risk and vulnerability. Now, I know what you're thinking, but, that was ancient Rome. We're so much more enlightened now. And, well, yes and no. While we've made progress in many areas, social inequality remains a persistent problem in many parts of the world. In fact, Some studies suggest that wealth inequality in certain countries is even more extreme today than it was in ancient Rome. Seriously, try wrapping your head around that for a second. Think about the issues of affordable housing, access to healthcare, and environmental justice. These are all modern-day echoes of the inequalities that plagued Roman society. The poor were often forced to live in the most polluted and dangerous parts of the city, just like they are today in many urban centers. And, when disaster struck, whether it was a fire in an insula or a hurricane in New Orleans, it was the most vulnerable populations who suffered the most. The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess. Oh, here's a slightly unsettling thought. Did you know that in some Roman cities, there were height restrictions on buildings? Ostensibly, this was to prevent the taller buildings from blocking the sunlight and views of the wealthier residents. But, some historians suspect that it was also a way to limit the power and influence of the lower classes. Because, a tall building means a lot of potential tenants, and a lot of potential political organizing. Talk about architectural control. Now, let's lighten the mood a bit. What did the Roman equivalent of the Homeowners Association newsletter look like? I'm picturing passive-aggressive notes about chariot parking etiquette and the appropriate hours for practicing your lyre. A friendly reminder that gladiatorial combat is prohibited in the courtyard after 10 p.m. And finally, resilience. Despite all the challenges, the people who lived in Roman apartments found ways to survive, to adapt, and even to thrive. They formed communities, they built social networks, and they found moments of joy and connection in the midst of hardship. Think about the small acts of kindness and cooperation that must have taken place in those cramped quarters. Sharing food, helping a neighbor in need, offering a kind word, these were the things that made life bearable, even in the face of adversity. The simple act of sharing a loaf of bread could be a revolutionary act of solidarity. The Roman people are described as remarkably resilient. Despite earthquakes, fires and civil unrest, the city always seemed to bounce back. Historians still argue about the exact reasons for this resilience, but it likely had something to do with the strong sense of civic identity and the network of social support that existed in Roman society. People felt a sense of belonging, a sense of responsibility to one another, and a belief in the future. It's a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, human beings have an incredible capacity for hope, for creativity, and for connection. It's something we really do need to remember today. We can look at that strength they exhibited in Roman life when we think about modern problems like climate change, economic inequality, and political polarization. These are daunting challenges, but they are not insurmountable. By learning from the past, by embracing our shared humanity, and by working together, we can build a more just, sustainable, and resilient future. Also, I bet they never had to deal with robocalls, which gives them one up on us. But, I will say, all this talk of dense urban living is making me crave a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods. Somewhere with no neighbors, no noise, and definitely no risk of fire. Who's with me? I could use a break from the endless parade of humanity. Well, as we wrap up this exploration of Roman apartment life, I hope you've gained a new appreciation for the challenges and the triumphs of the people who lived in those ancient insulae. Their story is a reminder that the past is always with us, shaping our present and informing our future. And that even in the most crowded and chaotic of circumstances, human connection and resilience can flourish. Now go take a moment to marvel at the intricate dance of existence. Okay, that's all folks. Sweet dreams, and don't let the bedbugs bite. Hopefully there aren't any in your modern, well-maintained apartment. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's ditch the marble palaces and the toga parties for a bit. Today, we're ditching the emperors and senators. Forget the gladiators for a hot minute. Instead, we're taking a stroll, or rather, a precarious climb, through the insulae of ancient Rome, those towering apartment buildings where the vast majority of Romans actually lived. Yeah, you heard that right, most Romans didn't have sprawling villas with fountains and mosaics. Imagine a Roman tenement building. Sounds glamorous, right? You wake up to the sounds of, well, everything. Roosters crowing, vendors shouting their wares, fish that's definitely been sitting out in the sun for a while, anyone? Kids screaming, carts rumbling over cobblestones. It's a sensory symphony of chaos, a full orchestra of urban noise. Sleep? What sleep? You're crammed into a small room, maybe with a window, maybe not. If you're lucky, you share it with just your family. If you're really lucky, the roof doesn't leak when it rains. Think of it as ancient studio apartment living, only without the stainless steel appliances or, you know, any appliances. Let's talk about those insulae. Historians still argue whether these buildings were primarily privately owned and rented out, or constructed and managed by large investment companies. Either way, they were built fast and, shall we say, frugally. We're talking shoddy construction, folks. Think of them as the ancient Roman equivalent of those condos built in the 2000s that are now mysteriously sinking into the ground. And surprise! They weren't made of marble either. The Romans definitely weren't as decadent and stylish as the movies always depict. Mostly, they were wood and brick. Fire was a constant danger. A major fire that burned for 9 days occurred during Nero's reign. Which, let's be honest, probably did not help property values. Staircases? Not exactly code compliant. You're essentially doing a daily cardio workout just getting to your room, especially if you live on one of the higher floors. Hey, at least you're getting your steps in, right? Now, let's talk about food. You can forget Uber Eats. Your daily bread, literally, is often what you can afford to buy from street vendors. A loaf of panis, maybe some olives, some cheese if you're feeling fancy. Cooking in your room? Risky. Remember the whole fire hazard thing? Most insulae lacked proper kitchens, so many Romans relied on street food or communal cooking facilities. Some residents might have owned small, portable braziers for heating food, but that was about it. You might think about your plumbing too, now that you mention food. Most insulae did not have running water. Toilets? Nope. You use a chamber pot, and then, well, let's just say sanitation wasn't exactly a priority. And that's why the streets of Rome were, shall we say, fragrant. On the plus side, it probably kept the tourists away. I'm kidding. There weren't any tourists. Romans had enough of their own people to deal with. Life in the insulae wasn't all doom and gloom, though. Despite the cramped conditions and the questionable hygiene, people built communities. Neighbors chatted in the stairwells, kids played in the streets, dodging carts and, well, other things, and life went on. In fact, according to one fringe theory, the close proximity might have actually fostered a greater sense of social cohesion among the lower classes. Think of it as the original, it takes a village mentality, but with more questionable plumbing and less personal space. And how about those fun pastimes of ancient Roman citizens? Forget Netflix and chill. Entertainment for the average insula dweller was more likely to involve watching a street performer, listening to music, or just gossiping with neighbors. Public baths offered a chance to socialize and, you know, get clean, sort of. There were also the public games, of course, chariot races, gladiatorial combats, and other spectacles. Although, let's be real, the cheap seats were really cheap seats. Still, a fun time was a fun time. You might have a job as a shopkeeper, a craftsman, or a laborer. You could be making pottery, weaving cloth, working in a bakery, or hauling goods around the city. The possibilities are almost endless. Almost. One thing you wouldn't be doing, earning a fortune. Life in the insulae was a constant struggle to make ends meet, a daily grind of hard work and meager rewards. Historians still argue whether there was a significant middle class in ancient Rome or if society was largely divided between the wealthy elite and the impoverished masses. Either way, if you were living in an insula, you definitely weren't sipping wine in a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples. So, you get the picture. life in the Roman Insula wasn't exactly a picnic. It was cramped, noisy, smelly, and often dangerous. It was a world away from the marble grandeur of the Roman Forum. But it was also where most Romans lived, a vibrant, chaotic, and ultimately resilient community that shaped the heart of the ancient world. So next time you see a movie about ancient Rome, remember the Insula, remember the ordinary people who lived and worked and struggled in those towering apartment buildings. It's time to quiet down now, and let those bustling streets fade. Imagine the sounds of the city softening, the shouts of vendors quieting to murmurs. The light of the setting sun warms the brick and stone around you, casting long shadows that stretch and blur the edges of the day. The air cools, bringing a gentle breeze that whispers through the narrow alleys, carrying the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Even the ever-present aroma of the city seems to mellow, becoming a soft, earthy fragrance. The weight of the day slowly lifting from your shoulders. Your small room, though simple, feels like a sanctuary. The sounds of the city now a distant lullaby. You find a quiet stillness within yourself, a sense of peace settling in your heart. Sleep comes easily, a gentle embrace that carries you away to dream of quieter days and brighter mornings. Rest now, knowing that the rhythm of the ancient world has lulled you into a peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams.